You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
Should I turn down the thermostat or overthrow the capitalist mode of production? That's the name of a new paper that I just wrote, and we'll be talking about that paper today, discussing the ecological crisis and its relationship to individual consumer behavior. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. In just a moment, we're going to be talking about ecology and capitalism. But first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes to talk about some current events. For the current events section today, we're going to be talking about the attempted coup in Germany, the far-right coup attempt from December 7th of this year. And we're going to have a special guest for the current events section today. We're welcoming back Ralph Keller, who was our guest on episode 23 of Radio Free Humanity. The episode was about the rise of the extreme right in Europe, and there was a special focus on Germany. So we asked Ralph to come back today to discuss this recent far-right coup attempt in Germany. So welcome back, Ralph Keller.
Thank you for having me.
I suppose a lot of our listeners probably have gotten the gist of the basic facts of the coup attempt by now from all the reporting on it, but maybe you, Ralph, could just give us a brief synopsis of what happened.
24 German women and men, plus one person from Russia, were arrested in raids across the country. And one additional arrest was made in Austria. Many of those who were arrested are active or former soldiers with special training. And we can talk a little bit more about these, the profile of these people. This was a heavy thing. It was a heavy raid because 3,000 security personnel took part in this raid. And I raided 130 properties that belong to 52 suspects in 11 German states. So not all 52 suspects were arrested, only 24. But the circle from which the arrest was made was like 52 suspects.
Do you think it's right to assume that they might scoop up more people in the future?
I think it might be inevitable that as the investigations progress, more arrests will be made.
Because you can't overthrow a government with 25 people,
no,
right? I would just guess that if they gotten far enough that it was a danger, that they had to be arrested, that there must be more people somehow.
If there will be another widespread arrest, then that would show how close they actually came. I hope they didn't come close.
We know that they were attempting to restore some kind of monarchy in Germany, and that they were associated with various kind of far-right tendencies, including apparently a big QAnon influence. Some news media were saying that the biggest following of QAnon outside of the United States is in Germany. Well, what do we know sort of ideologically about the orientation of these folks?
The reason why that is because the Reichsbürger scene in Germany is a very diverse, you might call it hodgepodge.
And what's Reichsbürger mean, first of all? I've seen the Reichsbürger movement characterized as anti-constitutional and opposed to liberal democratic order. So, what's the basic gist of their...
What unifies the Reichsbürger movement is a deep rejection of the Federal Republic of Germany as a state and the constitutional institutions of that state, because the movement rejects the current German constitution. That's what they do. And their argument is that either the German Empire before 1914 continues to exist, or the German Empire in the borders of 1937 continues to exist. And the reason why they claim this is because the 1919 constitution of the Weimar Republic, the republic that was established just after World War I, they argue that this constitution was never abolished. It does sound funny when when you read things like this, and I have a few more details later on about what they do, is okay, because that 1919 constitution was never abolished. It's still in force. Therefore, allegedly, the Federal Republic is not identical with the German Reich, with the Reich before World War II was lost. So, and therefore, Germany today is illegal constitutionally, as well as under international law. Yeah? So, and therefore, they say, de facto, today's Germany as a state is non-existent. Only the Reich before the World War II, only that continues to exist. And then they argue the Allied occupation of Germany has never actually ended. Well, officially it ended, but we're still under secret occupation. And well, this really sounds like conspiracy theory stuff, yeah.
It's funny, like this idea that the current constitution is invalid and the Second Reich or whatever was the constitution is still the real. This way of even like legitimizing like illiberal politics is so strange. It has to be rooted in some like historic fiction. It's like kind of spiritual fiction. But you see it in the U.S. too. They have like the sovereign citizens movement and the posse comitatus movement and these different far right anti-government groups, but they can't just be like, we're against the government, we want to replace it with this fascist government. They have to kind of create some like weird historical conspiratorial claim about how their philosophy is actually the real existing one, and that they commonly accept the government as some sort of fiction that people have been duped by. And it's a very strange way of legitimizing, instead of just saying we're fascists, we want to take over the country.
So they actually embrace elements of a monarchy. They reject bourgeois democracy as we know it today. They subscribe to historical revisionism, esoteric worldviews. And then one group within that, they subscribe to outright extremism, anti-Semitism, Holocaust denialism. So these are really, I would call them fascists. Yeah.
But not all of them are like straight up Nazis.
I don't think you can say they all are, but this doesn't make the movement any less dangerous.
There's been reporting in past years about the widespread problem of far-right extremists in the police system and the military in Germany. How do those problems relate to this coup attempt? Before this crackdown on the Reichsbürger movement, were there any successful attempts to like purge the far right from the military and police in Germany? And now that they're cracking down on the Reichsbürger, is there more political incentive to like crack down on the far right and the security and police forces?
The system has brushed the threat under the carpet for too long, trivialized it. Yeah, it's not a big deal. Also, we have in Germany, and this is my own translation of the name of that organization, it's the Center for Counter-Extremism and Counter-Terrorism. They've had different priorities in the past. So in 28 of their meetings, they were focusing on the climate change activists. And in only a small number of meetings did they look at the far right. And what came to mind here when I read this is a German comedian once coined the phrase like the German justice system wears an eye patch on the right eye, and in the left eye it wears a contact lens. Yeah.
I mean, what we have in the United States is traditionally a very fine gradation of the right wing, so that more and more extreme. And so like when you get the extreme like this group, there are probably not many people who outright affiliate with them or endorse what they're doing, but there are some that, won't want to criticize them. There's some that collaborate with things that they might be doing. So what would you say is the strength of not only this group, but taking it together, this group and people who are willing to look the other way, defend them, collaborate with like-minded things. I'm trying to say, okay, there's just these people as such, but then there's the milieu in which they operate. What would you say is the size of that milieu?
If I was planning a coup, I would want to make sure that once I took over, I could be pretty sure there'd be enough popular support for me to stay in power. I mean, I'm seeing like some polling that says the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland party, the far-right party, polls at like somewhere between 10 to 14% popularity, that 4.3% of Germans attended anti-coronavirus restriction protests in recent years, but another 7 or 11% or something voiced support for those anti-coronavirus protections. So there's kind of like maybe this 10%-ish, somewhere in that pocket of people who poll far right. That's not quite enough people to have mass support for your coup, but maybe there's enough. Maybe they thought, well, in addition to the far right, we might have another people who are far right adjacent enough that we could take over the military and there wouldn't be enough popular protests to stop us,
The numbers I was able to find, according to the Domestic Intelligence Service, according to a 2022 report by that Domestic Intelligence Service, is that the Reichsbürger movement has about 21,000 members. And they have close links with the AfD. There's an overlap of extreme right-wing views with the Pegida movement. And the Pegida movement, they are the ones that shout the replacement hypothesis. The immigrants, the refugees, the Muslims, they take over the Christian countries. So the Reichsbürger have sympathizers there. And then there is the lateral thinkers, the Querdenkers, that's mostly the anti-vaxxers. Recently, they have teamed up with the Pegida in a joint massive demonstration, and they share distrust in the government. They are the coronavirus deniers, anti-vaxxers. They also don't like the government. So there is an overlap of movements or ideologies across movements. And therefore, I would expect there is quite a few sympathizers that associate with the failed coup. But you're right. I hope that the support and the sympathizers, the movements, is not big enough to keep the new government in power if the coup succeeds. And in fact, they knew this because they had plans not only to talk to the Russians, but also to the Western allies to have a proper peace treaty. Going back to World War II, no peace treaty was made. So they want a proper peace treaty now and get the blessings from the Western allies to keep them in power.
Well, we are out of time for this segment, but thank you to Ralph Keller for coming on today to talk about this for our current events segment. Up next, we'll be talking about capitalism and the climate crisis.
Okay, so today we have a guest who's not a guest, and he needs no introduction because he's Brendan Cooney. I'll be interviewing Brendan about his new article in With Sober Senses, the Marxist-Humanist Initiative publication. And the title of the article is, Should I Turn Down the Thermostat or Overthrow the Capitalist Mode of Production? Subtitle, Further Thoughts on Marxist-Humanist Initiative's Perspective on the Ecological Crisis. So this is Brendan writing once again on the ecological crisis. He was the main author of MHI's statement on the ecological crisis published just about a year ago. And so now he's writing up further thoughts, and he'll be discussing that with me today. The new article begins this way. Future generations, in writing about this historical moment, may endlessly debate how humanity managed to stare imminent ecological crisis in the face, yet do nothing to forestall it. The mystery behind our current inaction will seem even more puzzling given the widespread acceptance of climate science and the widespread concern about climate change. explanations that appeal merely to bad actors or disinformation will likely not be entirely convincing to future historians, given that the failure of inaction is not limited to just some countries in certain years, but rather is a state of inaction that can be claimed by most all political parties of most all countries extending back in time for decades. Explanations that evoke the mass moral failing of an irresponsible cult of consumerism will also likely fall short, given the fact that there is no reliable way for consumers to make informed consumption choices that would noticeably reduce their carbon footprint. So this is the problematic that Brendan is facing. The most popular ways of explaining the crisis we face just don't hold water. So instead of spending your time telling us that they don't hold water, what you try to do is say, okay, here's what's really going on, folks. So what is really going on?
Like we laid out in our perspectives, we really have to look at the capitalist mode of production, which is a system of competition for profit, and the way that determines the range of actions available to all of the parties involved, whether that's good politicians, bad politicians, consumers, states, political parties. These are laws of competition that compel a logic of growth for the sake of growth. And it's a type of growth that tends to accelerate the emission of greenhouse gases rather than to decelerate them. It's one that disincentivizes other types of clean energy production. And it's one in which the realm of personal consumption, of consumer choice, has no effect on whether or not production is like reoriented toward more green production or more carbon intensive production. So that's the basic argument I'm trying to put forward in the paper. Specifically, I want to also in the paper do a lot of deconstructing this idea that we often have in our society, whether it's conscious or some kind of unconscious idea, but it's just a basic framework by which a lot of us have been sort of inculcated to think about the climate crisis, and that's the sense that all greenhouse gas emissions are somehow reducible to the personal choices of consumers, as if our own private moral failings are the reason for the climate crisis. That's just such an insidious idea, and it comes up in a lot of different ways in our society. And I'm trying to deconstruct that, not just in some kind of vague philosophical way, but to really get at the nuts and bolts of what types of activity produce greenhouse gas emissions, why those sectors tend to increase the amount of emissions rather than decrease them, and why that logic has really nothing to do with private choices that consumers make.
Okay, so we'll get further into that, into some of the nuts and bolts, but these are further thoughts, and you were the principal author of our perspective on the ecological crisis, and some of what you've just said was said in the earlier statement. So I'm going to ask you the kind of question I asked Michael Albert. What are you saying that's different this time? What's new?
I wanted to look more at this issue of victim blaming, the way that we often blame like individuals and their consumption choices for climate change, and to use the same framework that we used in the perspectives of talking about competition, talking about production for production's sake, increase of constant capital, all those things, but use them to look at this issue of like personal responsibility for climate change, and also to repeat some of the previous themes, because when you write things, you go to look at something and write it a second time, sometimes it comes out more clearly. A lot of the perspectives were devoted to like critiquing degrowth theory, and in the process of doing that, I think I worked out some things that I could say more clearly in like a second paper. But this paper doesn't even go into degrowth theory, but I kind of needed to go through that process of like critique to clarify some ideas.
Yeah, so you've been talking about the ideology of attributing the ecological crisis to consumer choices, and you say that it's a matter of blaming the victim. Why is this an important issue, though?
I think it's a way of thinking that's permeated a lot of different sides of the environmental crisis. I think about even how sometimes people gravitate to these like radical acts of non-consumption. I'm thinking of like Greta Thunberg's the teenage climate activist from Sweden, her famous boat trip she took across the Atlantic a few years ago, which was supposed to symbolize, I guess, like some radical act of like foregoing airplane travel for the sake of reducing the emissions of travel. But it's like an action that makes like very little sense when you look at it, not just because I mean, I have nothing against people making like personal symbolic actions to make a political point. I think that's fine. But the point that she's making, and I think Greta Thunberg's great in a lot of ways. She says a lot of things that are profound and inspiring. But that sort of flying shame a thing doesn't even really make a lot of sense. I mean, air travel is a tiny fraction of the global carbon footprint. But even beyond that, like refraining from various acts of personal consumption it focuses the camera in the wrong direction, as if the problem with greenhouse gas emissions is that people consume irresponsibly, and I don't think that is even the problem in the first place. You see this way of thinking in a lot of places, though. I think that in the realm of psychology and therapy, they're having to develop whole new modalities of personal therapy to deal with people's guilt around climate change. I think if you really believe that everything that's happening with climate change is ultimately reducible to like the moral failings of consumers, it would make sense to be like feel extremely guilty for that. I mean, it's like almost like a self-annihilating way of thinking where your existence on the planet is dooming future generations to all sorts of crises. Like, how could you not feel horrible if that's what you actually believe? And I think a lot of people have that sense of shame and dread.
And that seems to then have something to do with the title of the paper. Should I turn down the thermostat or overthrow the capitalist mode of production? I think a subtext here is, if you're very concerned about the moral failings of individuals, well, what's really behind that is you really think that it's the actions of individuals that need to change, rather than the system of production, the motive force, more expansion of value without end, and so forth.
Yeah, and I'm sure most people listening to this are familiar with this way of thinking, because I think a lot of people think this way and they talk about it all the time now. I hear it all the time. People apologize for having to drive somewhere when they could have taken the bus. They apologize for having to take a plane somewhere. They like make excuses, in a guilty way for their choices about travel or whatever it is, or they engage in some kind of virtuous signaling around choices they make about putting solar panels on their house or keeping their thermostat low, whatever it is. It's everywhere in the way people think about the climate problem.
Yeah, one of the ways that it manifests is in the very term carbon footprint. And this is among the emissions of the petroleum industry. This term, you mentioned that in the paper. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
And I've heard this in different places, but I hadn't read into the history of the term that closely. But apparently the term carbon footprint was created and marketed by the petroleum industry, maybe specifically by British Petroleum, as a way of trying to take attention away from the petroleum industry for all the pollution that they create. They thought by making people think of carbon emissions as something that they were personally responsible for, that they could take the heat off themselves. And it's pretty, explicit and deliberate that was what they were trying to do. It's probably surprising because the term is so well accepted now, but the petroleum industry, it shouldn't be that surprising given what we know about the petroleum industry's funding of anti-climate science research and the perpetuation of all sorts of post-truths around climate issues. But though people on the left know to not trust the anti-science coming out of the petroleum industry around climate change, people have pretty much uncritically adopted the notion of carbon footprint, which basically is a way of reducing all industrial pollution to the moral failings of individuals. We talk about the carbon footprint of households, about the carbon footprint of countries. Never do we talk about the carbon footprint of capitalism as an economic system that has an increasing carbon footprint by necessity.
Right. And as I understand it, by the way, British Petroleum, BP, These are the people, they've got gas stations all around, everywhere. Green and gold, BP gas stations, that's British Petroleum. So it's a very, very big global company. As I understand it, what they did is they took, this idea of carbon footprint, popularized it, and added this word in front of it, personal, as a way of saying, oh, well, what is your carbon footprint? What do you do? How are you responsible? And the subtext is, you are responsible rather than we are responsible. This was very intentional on their part. So I guess we should not use the term carbon footprint. We should use the term like carbon business plan, carbon business model, something like that. Yeah.
And even like radical groups like Extinction Rebellion, I quote them in the paper. They say on their website that, quote, ultimately the climate and ecological crisis is a crisis of human overconsumption. And the same vibe, we hear this like notion of the Anthropocene, which tries to characterize this the effect of humans on the environment as currently in our current era as like a new era in geological history, driven by not capitalist production, but by just the fact that human beings are on the planet, that we're just so destructive by nature that we're like altering everything about the planet on like a cellular level. But it's really not, human beings have been around for a long time. If you look at the, history of human beings, we've been around for tens of thousands of years. It's only been in the past 100 years that we started destroying the planet. So it really makes no sense to like characterize the age as an Anthropocene. Should be like a capitalocene or whatever. I don't know what the word would be, but you get the idea. But this idea of like blaming human behavior, private consumption, human overconsumption, moral failings of consumers, it's all like part of the same way of thinking, which blames individuals and blames human beings for like their base nature, rather than thinking about what sort of social organization or society creates the situation in which we're collectively destroying the planet. We all know what's happening. None of us want it to happen, but it's happening anyway.
Right. Okay. But I'll tell you, when you quote Extinction Rebellion and they say, ultimately, this is all a problem of human overconsumption, what this brought to my mind was Paul Mahler Sweezy, Paul Sweezy, the founder of the Monthly Review School, writing, ultimately, all production is production for human consumption, and anything that tries to contradict that is just nonsense, whatever he said. But he did say, ultimately, all production is production for human consumption. And whether knowingly or unknowingly, I think that is the claim that is underlying this idea that, look, when you come down to it, since all production is production for human consumption, it's, in the end, people over consuming, and therefore that's why we've got all these ecological problems. It seems to me that that's what that ultimately is trying to tell us. So it's rooted in this idea that all production is ultimately production for human consumption. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, it was in thinking about this parallel between the sort of underconsumptionism of the Monthly Review School, when they say that all production is for personal consumption, and the framework we often hear around climate change, where all greenhouse gas emissions are reducible or seemingly to personal consumption. It was in thinking about the parallel between those two that I started to want to write on this topic and think back to the sort of stuff that MHI and you have written on the topic in the past. MHI, Marxist-Humanism, the work you've done, Andrew, in critiquing underconsumptionism, the work Dunevskaya did in talking about the mode of production in the Soviet Union. We already have like an understanding of the relationship of personal consumption to the capitalist mode of production that can help us look at this question and make sense of it. Because what we know from all those various endeavors I just mentioned is that, that capitalist societies are not driven by personal consumption choices, that there are laws of competition that compel the growth of production, and those laws are not reducible to the private consumption choices of individuals. And we can, go into that in some detail later. In fact, not all production is production for personal consumption, and we can go into that later as well.
I think we should, or maybe we can go into that now, because, I mean, the way a lot of people think is there's upstream and downstream, and everything ultimately results in a product that a person consumes. So you got the farm implement industries, and they produce hose, and they produce tractors and so forth, and you got the steel for that. So the steel starts with iron, which starts with ore. So you got the ore, you got the iron, you got the steel, you got the farm implements, you got the agricultural sector. But in the end, they produce food. And who consumes the food? Well, it might be restaurants, but who consumes what the restaurants produce? It's people. Okay? So isn't it ultimately all a problem of human consumption?
Well, I'd like to talk about that, but first, I'd like to look at this chart that's in the paper and just disambiguate like some of the greenhouse gas emissions and where they come from in the global economy first, because I think just that by itself is a good starting point.
Okay, so let me just interrupt. It's in the paper. It's a pie chart taken from our World in Data, a well-known website, and it's entitled Global Greenhouse Gas Emissions by Sector. So the pie chart breaks down global greenhouse gas emissions, in other words, the carbon whatever, in terms of which sector is emitting these gases.
Yeah, I think this is really useful to look at because, I think a lot of people, when you ask them, like, where is all this pollution coming from? Where are the greenhouse gas emissions coming from? They think, like, cars, because that's something we do every day, a lot of us, right? We get in a car, we burn gas. We know that what we're doing is making the planet hotter every time we get in our car. We see, like, thousands of cars every day on the road with our own eyes, burning gas. People talk about, what do we need to do? Oh, we need electric cars. We need blah, 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 right? Well, if you look at this pie chart, put together by Our World in Data. The authors are Hannah Ritchie and Max Roser. Road transportation globally is responsible for just around 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. About 40% of that, 11%, is commercial transportation. So the transportation of private individuals, personal car use, is about 7.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's not an insignificant chunk, but that's actually a pretty small amount of the global greenhouse gas emissions, which I think a lot of people don't even realize. I mean, I've had many conversations with people since I, saw this chart and, talked to them about it. People spend all this time worrying, should I buy an electric car? They're really expensive, blah, blah, blah. And I say, well, look, that's great if you want to do that. But did you know that globally, like, this is a tiny fraction of the pollution that's created in the global economy. And the other thing people stress out a lot about is like their home heating costs, their home electrical costs, turning lights off in the room when they're not there, blah, blah, blah. Residential buildings, energy use, that's heating and all electrical use, that's just over 10% of the global carbon footprint. If you put that together with air travel and landfills, which also, all the trash we produce creates a little bit of carbon waste. All that is like personal actions that we take on a day-to-day basis that create greenhouse gas emissions. That's about like 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Everything else is emissions that are created by industry.
Right. And like you say, a lot of the transportation is, trucking companies, commercial transportation. A lot of the buildings are commercial buildings or, airports and stadiums and office buildings and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. I think people don't necessarily realize that most of the greenhouse gas emissions, the vast majority on the planet, are coming from industrial practices. It could be agriculture. It could be the production of materials. It could be the production of consumer goods. It can be, production of things like chemicals and cement. It can be livestock and manure, making of steel and iron, petrochemicals, all these different industrial processes that are part of the global economy. That's most of what is creating the greenhouse gas emissions. Your own private actions that you take on a day-to-day basis, driving your car, heating your home, that's part of it, but it's a small part of it. Most of it is coming from industry. So then the question is, why does industry create so much pollution? And is it just because people keep buying things on Amazon? Or is there some other logic at play that is creating a system in which this industrial activity is destroying the planet? Hey, we're going to return to this conversation in just a moment, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes to hear from Anja Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing, an all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist humanism. Please join us.
So, up to this point, your argument is, to use the carbon footprint metaphor, BP has a Bigfoot carbon footprint, and you have a little tiny little toe print, right? So that's where we are at this point. And then you're about to say something which I think is harder to understand. Yeah, what is that?
Well, there are really two things. Maybe there are three things. One is just that the process of capitalist competition itself is one that rewards behavior that is more carbon intensive. That's because capitalist competition compels and rewards firms to develop their means of production, to invest more in machinery and raw materials. And those are processes which are carbon intensive, and they're increasingly carbon intensive as there's more and more investment in material production and developing the means of production. And building new factories, building new machines, needing new raw materials. Those are all things that have a rising carbon footprint as the constant capital required for production increases, to use Marx's term.
Okay, so you say that basically they mechanize, they have more capital intensive, so to speak, not labor intensive technology. They adopt labor saving technical changes, right? And you said that there's a compulsion there and there's a reward there. What's the compulsion? What's the reward?
Well, the reward is that this is how you compete. This is how you lower your unit cost per commodity and dominate more of the market. And the compulsion is that if you don't compete against your competitors who are doing such, then you go out of business because you can't make things as efficiently. So if your factory in the U.S. is based on manual labor and you're competing against a Chinese firm that is fully automated, then you can't produce as cheaply and you can't stay in business. But these are processes that are inherently more carbon intensive because they're more industrial. They require more energy. They require more production of materials. I before I started researching this kind of thing, I didn't realize that just the production, making cement is highly carbon intensive. Building a new factory, just outside of the energy consumption, just like making cement is really carbon intensive. Building a new factory, all those kind of things are bad for the planet. And that's what capitalists are compelled to do by competition. They're not compelled to do that because consumers are asking for it. Consumers have no idea where their products come from and can't make any educated choices about these things. It's just the process of competition which is making it happen.
Right. I guess one could say, well, people are to blame because they want to get things as cheaply as possible. And more advanced technologies allow producers to produce at lower cost. And because they produce at lower cost, they can price their stuff at lower prices. And you could say that that's all due to consumers wanting things as cheaply as possible. And who doesn't? But even in that case, you look at the incomes of the vast majority of the population, people are just getting by. So it's not like, oh, we're just greedy and we want to get things as cheaply as possible. People have to get things as cheaply as possible because capitalism doesn't provide massive incomes for the working population.
And now, a lot of people have this idea that they should be making more ecologically responsible choices as consumers. And so, of course, so much of production now is accompanied by some level of greenwashing. It could be that they promise some sort of carbon offset when you buy their product, or they just have the word green somewhere in the packaging, or there's a picture of a tree, or there's a bunch of ridiculous packaging in your package, and then there's some note that says this is amazing packaging, please save it, don't throw it away. I got something my kids got something today, and there was this bag, in this plastic bag that said, this is a cool bag, don't throw it away. And I guess you're supposed to be really amazed at how the ecological wokeness of this company that can tell me not to throw away this cool plastic bag.
Oh, I got stories about this. I won't bore you with it, but it's amazing. I mean, you go into the grocery store, they sell you bags you don't even ask for. They charge you 33 cents a bag, and then they deliver the food. They could deliver the food in a box without the bags. They're selling you these bags. The bags say, oh, this is a reusable, recyclable the bag. It can be used 125 times. But every time you go into the store, they hawk these bags at you. So,
yeah, and apparently it's kind of ambiguous to what extent reusable shopping bags are better for the environment than single-use plastic bags. They're made of heavier material, and so they have a higher carbon footprint to be produced. So you actually have to use them a lot of times, by some estimates, a few hundred times or a few thousand times before they outweigh the carbon footprint of just using a single-use plastic bags. So it's all very difficult for the individual consumer to take all these things into consideration and make actual reasoned, responsible, ethical, ecological purchasing decisions about the consumption of products whose come from these very complex supply chains and have very complex, difficult to calculate carbon footprints. We just aren't equipped to make those kind of decisions as individuals. Even this question of should I buy an electric car for the tiny amount of people who can afford an electric car. I've read research that was done that argued that actually keeping your old car for as long as possible is better for the environment than buying a new electric car. Because, of course, producing a new car is a carbon-intensive industrial process. And actually running your old car into the ground, in the one study I read, is better for the environment than buying a new electric car.
Yeah, I mean, given that states in the U.S. also have emission standards, and so, I mean, you can't do that if the car doesn't pass some kind of emission standard. And then there's all the recycling scam. What do you know any figures about what the net gain from recycling is? Because there's a lot of energy and stuff expended in the recycling processes.
Yeah, I don't have exact figures to share on the carbon footprint of recycling, but there are a lot of myths and propaganda around recycling. For instance, plastic recycling is pretty much just a propaganda concept created by the petroleum industry to make people feel less guilty about consuming plastics. I mean, the vast majority of plastics that you put in a recycling bin are just incinerated or buried in landfills. They don't get recycled because they can't really be recycled. I think only 10% of consumer plastics get recycled. Metal is a much better material that can be recycled and actually does lower the carbon footprint, I believe, of some metals to engage in metal recycling. But plastic is not like that. It breaks down chemically very quickly. It can only really be recycled once, and there are too many different types of plastic to make it feasible to recycle plastics. I'm sure future sociologists, if there are any, will have a field day studying like the cult of recycling in our society. That's a deep one, We all do it. I recycle religiously, and I know it all goes into an incinerator in Philadelphia. I don't know. I can't stop doing it because I think I'm supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when all of this started. I'm old enough to remember when this started, and they weren't yet blaming people. At least that wasn't on my screen. I wasn't conscious of blaming people. But I mean, already, and we're talking about 1972, 1973, already it was, here's what you can do, here's what we can do to save our planet. And it was like recycling and all of this kind of thing. So that's been going on 50 years at least. So yeah, so you were basically saying that there's like incentives, rewards, and compulsion for capitalists to screw up the environment. And one thing you pointed to was reducing costs through technological advancement, which is bad for the environment. Is there anything else that's at issue there?
Well, there's an advantage in competition to economies of scale. The larger the factory, the more efficiently it uses its resources, so it can produce more for less input cost and outcompete its rivals. So there's a certain inherent economic advantage to being a larger firm, larger factories, larger companies that are multinational corporations with lots of different aspects to what they do and a big global production chain, and they have control over all these parts of the chain. That's like inherently successful companies move in those directions in the capitalist society because that's what is advantageous in the process of competition. And by nature, those larger production facilities are more carbon intensive than smaller firms, almost by definition. Their buildings are bigger, they take more carbon to produce the buildings, the machinery uses more energy, they need more and more raw material inputs, and that is more carbon intensive. So the whole process just becomes more carbon intensive the longer the capitalist economic activity goes on.
Right. So the reward again is they can, by being big, they can reduce their costs, outcompete their rivals, get additional profit by selling cheaper, by lowering their costs, and then they can sell cheaper. And the compulsion is,
if they don't do it, someone else will.
The upshot of this is it's not just lack of concern for people, although that's there, and it's not irrational within the capitalist system, given the way it operates. This behavior is very rational. You're trying to be as efficient as possible. You're putting in the latest technology. You're being big so you can produce cheaply instead of wasting a lot. So there's a certain rationality to the whole thing. And the problem is it's capitalist rationality.
Yeah. It's just insanely destructive. You were setting up this question earlier, Andrew, and then I directed us somewhere else. But
oh yes, the upstream and the downstream, and ultimately it starts off with the mining of ore, and then you get the steel, you get the farm implements, you get the food, and no, the people don't eat the food. The restaurants buy the food, but then they turn it into meals, and people eat the food. It all comes down to people and their consumption, right?
I mean, this is all something I learned from you a long time ago in studying Volume 2 of Capital. It was deep because I had studied Volume 2 of Capital. It was actually the first part of Capital I read. Most people start with Volume 1. I'd read all these other post-Marxists talking about the reproduction schemes and capital. So I was like, I'm going to read some Marx. And I went and just read the reproduction schemes at the end of volume 2. That was like how I started reading Capital. But I did not get what was actually going on because I was reading it through the lens of what like people like David Harvey were trying to say with the reproduction schemes, which has nothing to do with what Marx was actually trying to do. And you set me straight on that a long time ago and explained that what Marx was trying to do in the end of volume 2 is to address this very question is can we conceive of capitalist production as all being something that resolves in the end to consumption, that comes to consumption of humans? Is this what all this production is for? And the answer is no, that there is a portion of capitalist production which is just production for production's sake. Marx divides the economy into 2 different departments, he calls them. Department 1, which produces means of production, producing machines and factories and raw material, partially finished goods and et cetera. And then there's Department 2, which is producing consumer goods, things that people consume, food, clothes, toys, whatever. And it's not true that everything, that all the value produced in Department 1 then moves into Department 2 and then is sold to consumers. There's actually a portion of the value in Department 1 that is just remains in Department 1 the entire time. And one of the ways we know this is that Department 1 can grow faster than Department 2. And this is actually something that we can observe empirically. And I quote in my paper, I cite a paper of yours, Marx's reproduction schemes as an unbalanced growth model. We've discussed it on the podcast. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you the name of the episode, but we discussed it. And you point out, Andrew, and you can probably say more than I can here, but that this is actually a theme we see in, you talk about not only Lenin talking about it, but that in the economic development literature, people talk about this phenomena that in developing countries that Department 1 grows faster than Department 2, that actually there's a decrease consumption relative to the increase in productive activity. This was something that Raya Dunayevskaya pointed to as evidence that the Soviet Union was a capitalist society. It's something that we can observe in China today. And it's like an inherent part of capitalism, this trade-off between consumption and industrial expansion. And it's also what it means in terms of the question of greenhouse gas emissions is that there's actually a part of capitalist productive activity which is not just burning fossil fuels in order to sell people stuff. It's just burning fossil fuels in order to create more means of production. It's like machines making machines for the point of making machines and burning fossil fuels in the process. And as I mentioned in the paper, I was able to find some research into this very issue. They're not using Marxist terms, but there's an environmental economist named Edgar Hertwich, which has a paper called Increased Carbon Footprint of Material Production, Driven by the Rise in Investments. It's a super catchy title, but I linked to it in the paper. And he talks about this very thing. He says that actually the carbon footprint of investments, this like investment in capital, is growing faster in the global economy than the carbon footprint of investment in consumer goods. So it's like it's a real process. It's not just a theoretical way of framing things in order to like blame capitalists instead of blame consumers. It's like a real phenomenon in our society that the production of means of production for the sake of means of production, it has a carbon footprint that's growing faster than the carbon footprint of the production of consumer goods.
Right. And if I remember, a good deal of the disproportionate growth of greenhouse gases from production for industry rather than for personal consumption, a lot of that was related to China, yeah. Development of the Chinese economy, the industrialization of China. Can you give us a sense of the time frame here and the magnitude of the disproportion?
So this is what Hertwich says in his paper, that between 1995 and 2015, the carbon footprint of consumption rose by 64%. So that's the carbon footprint of goods that are made for human beings to consume, 64%. But the carbon footprint of investment rose by 170%. more than 2.5 times as rapidly. In other words, the greenhouse gases created by capital formation are increasing much more rapidly than the greenhouse gases created by consumption and the production of consumption goods.
Yeah, that's a huge difference in the rate of increase, and it's for the space of a whole generation. So it's not just a one-off thing; it's a trend. Yeah.
And the carbon footprint of consumption, why does it rise? I haven't seen the breakdown, but I would assume there's more people on the planet, that they're more hooked into a global economy, which is carbon dependent, right? Increasingly hooked into, means of consumption that are carbon reliant. The carbon footprint of investment doesn't have to say, it's rising because that's just what capitalism does, is it has explosive economic growth, and it invests in more and more machinery for their own sake. And this is what happens, is you have that sector of the economy growing 2.5 times as rapidly as consumption.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting. I mean, because you mentioned two things: more people and being more tied into polluting, environmentally destructive processes. It'd be interesting to put it on a per-person basis, because over a 20-year period, I don't know what the global growth in population was, but it's not insubstantial. So it's quite conceivable that on a per-person basis, what would you say, 64% for consumption, maybe that was like 30% growth per person, but then you're talking about still something like 140% or so for in industrial production, not for consumption. That would show the disparity even more starkly. Yeah.
I think a bunch of the things that I've tried to point to in this paper could be developed a lot more, especially by someone who has a better grasp of environmental economics than I do in terms of crunching numbers, because I can't do it myself. I gotta find other people's papers and try to make sense of them. I'm just surprised that we're not seeing more of this kind of conversation in the environmental literature. I would expect to see more discussion of this kind of phenomenon, because it seems really the meat of the whole problem.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, to be able to do something like what Hertwig did, you not only need to know that field, you need to understand matrix algebra, you need to understand input-output analysis. So, I mean, it actually doesn't surprise me all that much. Yeah, I mean, you don't see any of this in the popular literature. So, I mean, we've discussed one of the themes of your new paper, which is this blaming of consumers for the ecological crisis. It doesn't wash. Here's what's really going on. It all has to do with capitalist production, the laws of capitalist production being enforced by competition. But there's another theme, as we said in the beginning, which is explaining the ecological crisis, or trying to explain it by talking about bad actors, disinformation. That doesn't cut it either. So what is it that you go on to say about that issue?
There's a certain type of thinking in the environmental movement and other movements as well, that if we just put the right people in charge with the right ideas, then we could get the right things done. In the environmental movement, we often get the idea that all these failings of our leaders and our countries and parties are just because the wrong people are in power, or they're corrupted, or there's too much propaganda from the fossil fuel industry. I don't think those are very compelling ways of explaining such a massive failure. If the system is structured to work a certain way, it's going to keep working that way regardless of who's in charge. I mean, that's like the short version of the thing. There's this kind of underlying assumption behind a lot of environmental politics that we already have the right ideas and technology that we need to solve the crisis. And if we just had the right people in place, then we could execute those ideas and be on our way to, or hopefully forestalling climate catastrophe. But as I point in the paper, it's just not the case that we even have green technologies available to replace fossil fuels for certain things. And the reasons we don't have those available are because there's no incentive within the capitalist mode of production to even develop technologies to replace fossil fuels. I give the example of industrial heating, which is maybe the best example. By some estimates, industrial heating contributes like maybe up to 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions every year. Industrial heating is like the high-intensity heat that's needed to create certain materials like steel. You can't do that with current green technologies at all. You need to be burning like coal, oil on site to create really high heat so that you can, melt things and make steel and whatever. We don't have a technology to replace fossil fuels for that yet, and there are some reasons we don't have that. I cite a piece by David Roberts, a journalist from a couple of years ago in Vox, where he writes about this problem, and he gives several reasons why we don't have a good replacement, and I think they're really interesting. He points out that, look, industrial materials are globally traded commodities, and they compete on razor-thin profit margins, right? Globally. So if your national policy was to put a carbon tax on steel production in your country, that production is just going to move overseas. And the nature of capitalist competition between nation states is that people want to keep material production in their own borders for their own national security interests. They don't want heavy industries moving to other countries. So there's a basic geopolitical competition, capitalist competition overlapping each other here to make it really unlikely that there would even be states putting pressure on industries to change their carbon emissions from material productions like that. Furthermore, industrial heating technology is built into the design of these fixed capital investments. These factories that make things like steel, they're built to last decades and decades. So to close them and open up different factories with different types of production processes would be a real financial hit to those industries. So you can see by this one example how within the capitalist mode of production, there are not any incentives to even begin to develop technology in the way it needs to be developed to phase out fossil fuels. And again, this is a great counter to the argument that we hear sometimes that when people claim that we already have the ideas and the technology we need to replace fossil fuels. It just isn't true. And it's not true because of capitalism. One of the other things that I point out, we talked about earlier, is that there's this trade-off between the development of Department 1, the means of production, and the production of consumer goods. And when capitalist societies invest more in the development of means of production, there's a relative hit that needs to be taken by production of consumption goods. The sort of promises of green capitalism, of the Green New Deal, tend to paint everything in these rosy pictures where there are no economic trade-offs anymore. Like there's no trade-off between massive investments and changing the productive base of society to green production and wages, right? According to the Green New Deal proponents, everything's going to, wages are going to grow, jobs are going to be better, and we're going to have all these investments in green technologies. And carbon emissions there's no trade-offs economically, and that's just not the way capitalism works. There's always trade-offs between things. So I think this sort of false optimism that we have behind some of the Green New Deal politics, as much as I agree with the sentiment that we need radical system-wide change, seems like unrealistic. And it's unrealistic because it doesn't actually look at the nuts and bolts of capitalism and why capitalism is so bad for the environment.
Right. I mean, I think those people's pronouncements need to be given some scrutiny, whether the numbers add up. And what we saw with other things coming from the Bernie Sanders campaign were not reassuring in terms of accounting for the trade-offs and so forth, as you were saying. A lot of creative accounting there. I mean, of course, you got new green industries, you create jobs and all of this, but in the end, you need to see the entire thing and not anecdotes. I don't know if anybody has done a real accounting. But I would like to see an accounting of what would be the net impact on global greenhouse emissions. The net impact. If there's going to be a reduction, how is that reduction going to come about? What is going to take a hit as a result? Is there going to be a drop in production? Well, there's going to be new jobs, new sectors. Yeah, okay, but what's the total throughout the economy? What's the total number of jobs? Unless you see the total accounting, it becomes impossible to evaluate this stuff.
Hey, that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanist Initiative.org to listen to other episodes and to read more about these issues and others. As always, if you like the podcast, we encourage you to write to us, to comment and rate the podcast, and of course to share with all your friends and enemies.